Thank you very much, Andrea. It was beautiful. And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." When I was growing up, my family often spent summer evenings at the cottage looking at pictures, projected slides a lot of the time, and some of the time wonderful 16-millimeter home movies that my dad had made. They were movies of earlier happy holiday times and full of familiar faces. I'm sure many of you have done that kind of thing, because for many of us, summer is a very popular time both for taking and sharing pictures. The technology has changed a little bit, but the subjects, not so much. I find that summer is also a good time for browsing through our family faith album. That is this quite thick faith family album. And looking in there at some of the pictures of our revered ancestors in the faith in order to learn from them. This Sunday and next, I ask you to do just that with me. Today, I invite you to look in particular at the picture of Jacob. Had you been flipping through the album, you would have already noticed some of his family members: Abraham and Sarah, his grandparents; Isaac and Rebekah, his parents; Esau, his brother; and his wives, Rachel and Leah. In those days, it was common to have a backup or two. And his uncle Laban. If you kept going, you would come to the second youngest of his 12 sons, the one that Andrew Lloyd Webber made very popular, and Donny Osmond made a kind of household name through the much-loved musical Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I learned this summer when we were on holidays, we took in a Donny and Marie show, and I learned that Donny had actually performed the role of Joseph 1,200 times. Well, looking at photo albums often leads to remembering and reflection, and when shared with others, to much conversation, storytelling, and learning. It is certainly that way with our Faith Family album. What immediately catches the eye in this photo of Jacob is his rather ragged appearance, as though he had just finished a triathlon or had had a very bad night, which really isn't very far from the case, because Jacob has spent the night wrestling with none other than God. And as strange as that may be, it's stranger yet that he has managed to get through that wrestling match somewhat unscathed, not entirely, because his hip is dislocated, but he's come away okay. And according to the account we read earlier, he has not let his opponent off very easily. "I will not let you go," he says, "unless you bless me." Unless you bless me. Initially, Jacob's appeal seems foreign to us, who in many ways, as we recently celebrated on Canada Day, for example, feel very richly blessed. Yet the stark contrast of that with the images that regularly bombard our senses on the daily news leads us in empathy with Palestinian and Israeli, Syrian, Iraqi, or Ukrainian in synagogue, mosque, or church to cry out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." We think of the stolen schoolgirls of Nigeria and their families, or the victims and families of MH17, and on their behalf we cry out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." We think of Canadian Aboriginals and the plethora of unanswered land claims and centuries-old treaties still not honored, not to mention the myriad unresolved residential school issues. And with them, too, we cry out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Closer to home, we think of hurting people in the pews beside us, or in our circles of family and friends, and of all the losses there: jobs, relationships, health, loved ones. And on behalf and with all of them, cry out, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And we think of the times in our own lives when pain and loss and confusion reigned, when Jacob's words were very much on our own lips, because the truth is, Jacob's appeal is universal. It belongs to all of us. There is nothing foreign about it at all. Unless you bless me. If you look at some of the earlier pictures of Jacob, you will see something other than the strange mixture there of exhaustion and relief that we see in this photo before us today. A cunning, crafty quality, if you will, perhaps, or a guilt or fear or anger, because all of those things are part of Jacob's life. Initially, he's forced to flee his own home because of the rage of his brother Esau, the firstborn of the two. Jacob, you see, has stolen Esau's birthright, literally extorted it from him one day for a plate of stew, just when Esau had arrived home famished from the hunt. Then there is the matter of the very important blessing of their father, which should have gone to Esau, the firstborn, but had gone to Jacob instead through his cunning, crafty ways with his mother. His mother Rebekah, they put animal fur on his hands and arms and his neck, so that his blind father, in feeling him, would think it was Esau, much more the hairier of the two sons. And so Isaac had offered that blessing to Jacob instead of to Esau. And it, once being given, could not be revoked. And it isn't simply that Jacob will now inherit more of the family fortune. Jacob will be the one who will carry the blessing, first given to Abraham and Sarah, and then only to Isaac. That Esau was mad enough even to kill Jacob was perhaps understandable. Well, these things send Jacob fleeing to the home of his uncle Laban, with whose youngest daughter Rachel Jacob immediately falls madly in love. But in Laban, Jacob meets his match for both trickery and deceit. After laboring for 7 years on the family farm in order to earn Rachel's hand, Jacob discovers on the morning after the wedding, as he lifts the veil, it's not Rachel at all, but Leah, the older sister. Some veil, I say. Rachel was going to take another 7 years of labor. Well, other irregularities on the farm followed. In the end, Jacob gets totally fed up with the whole thing and steals away in secret with his whole company of wives and concubines and servants and flocks and herds. How does one steal away in secret with all of that? Beyond me. Anyway, that's what the story says. And in the process, Rachel succeeds in stealing her father's household gods. And all of that precludes any thoughts of ever returning to Laban's home. Laban does pursue Jacob, however, but proves to be more kindly disposed to him than we might have imagined. In the end, they establish a kind of mutual non-aggression pact, marked by a pillar past which neither will venture in order to do the other harm. And the pillar is named Mizpah, literally watch post, reflecting Laban's words, "May the Lord keep his eye on you and me while we are away from each other." Our very familiar Mizpah benediction cast in a very different way, but I'm sure many of you grew up in YPU, did you? And the last thing you did before you went home, you stood in a circle and you said that Mizpah benediction to one another. Well, against all of this turmoil, Jacob heads back to his father's house, hoping against hope that Esau's anger has abated. But just to sort of hedge his bets, he sends some servants on ahead with a huge present for Esau. And along the way, the company fords a stream in the night, but Jacob, sending all the others on ahead of him, stays on that side to wrestle with what's ahead of him, to try to sort things out. Time for sober reflection. Will the present work? Will Esau still be seeking my life? If so, what then? And what of God's promise passed to him by his father and confirmed in that dream of the ladder reaching up to heaven, that through his line all earth would be blessed? Well, Jacob's quiet time turns out not to be so quiet, but as we saw at the beginning, an all-night wrestling match. The text simply reads, "Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak." Near morn, when the stranger sees that he is not prevailing, he strikes Jacob on the hip, putting it out of joint. "Let me go," says the stranger, "for it is near daybreak." "No," says Jacob, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The blessing is given, the stranger disappears, Jacob becomes Israel, and the place is named Peniel. For, says Jacob, "I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." Is it all a vision, a kind of dream? Who knows? This much is clear. For Jacob, it has been a very real face-to-face encounter with the living God, one that ends in blessing. That's why, if you look very carefully at the photo, you can see behind the exhaustion, behind the new limp, a glimmer of hope and perhaps of peace in Jacob's eyes. Like that Canaanite woman about whom Lori told us and read in our gospel lesson, that one who comes to Jesus seeking healing for her mentally deranged child and persists even in the face of the best efforts of the disciples to shoo her away. In that same way, Jacob persists and is not disappointed. Jacob, whose life has been a rocky, tumultuous road of deceit, misadventure, fear, flight, and self-doubt, persists in this mysterious nocturnal encounter with God until God's blessing is given. Jacob isn't passive in all of this. He has taken the initiative to go home. He has sent all those gifts ahead for Esau. God does expect us to do our part. Still, Jacob moves forward with some trepidation. He is aware that Esau is coming with 400 men, intent, as far as he knows, to do harm to him and his company. But thankfully, the end result is not harm. It's a happy result. We read in Genesis 34, Esau ran to Jacob, threw his arms around him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. Isn't that a wonderful end to the story? Esau ran, embraced him, fell on his neck, kissed him, and they wept. Doesn't always turn out this way, of course. One need only think of the family of that 5-year-old Albertan Nathan O'Brien and his grandparents who vanished without a trace. In spite of our best efforts, plans and dreams can be dashed. None of us needs reminding that terrible things do happen. And sometimes, too, it just seems that we made too much of a mess of things for God to bother with us. What can God do with lives that at times have been very self-serving, often more full of doubts and fears, second-guessing, and failures of nerve than of faith? Sometimes, too, we wonder how we can go on trusting when everything around us seems upside down. Fighting continues around the globe. The environment remains under siege. Without a warning, a job is lost, a child is alienated, a marriage is broken, our health lets us down. People from whom we expected more disappoint us. An accident claims a life, and God seems 1,000,000 miles away. But in the midst of it all, God speaks to us through the stories of the people of God. And today, through this particular story of Jacob, and urges us to see God bigger than that, to hang in however hard it gets, to continue to pray, to read our Bibles, to come to worship, to tell our story, to talk to friends and family, to struggle it out with God, and not to let go until God blesses us. And there is hope to be found in this struggle. Maybe not exactly the answer we had in mind, but perhaps a new way forward we never could have imagined. For according to the very ancient promise made to Jacob's grandparents and brought to fulfillment in the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, grace does indeed triumph. God will bless us, indeed blessing us, making the wounded whole, healing our broken world and broken selves, bringing life out of death, is from first to last what God is all about. Thanks be to God. Amen.